Hi, my name is Rachel Scheck, and today I'm going to teach y'all about primary and secondary sources in the classroom setting. So first we need to differentiate between a primary and a secondary source. First we'll start with primary source. A primary source are pieces of evidence that are collected or created at the time of an event. This is anything that is created while an event is happening that can be used as a later date that we can reflect on. So a primary source could be a lot of different things. It could be an opinion poll, it could be a diary entry, it could be a journal, it could be a picture, it could be a video, something that's created in the moment that we'll look back on. So I'm going to talk about some specific primary sources just to explain it a little bit. And I'm going to use the Watergate scandal as an example. A lot of us have learned about it in history class or have come across it sometime in our life, and there are a lot of primary sources out there about the Watergate scandal. One form of a primary source are documents or kind of paper records, something that's written down, whether it be a newspaper, a journal entry, something like that. And so, for example, with Watergate, we have the newspaper, and this is a good example of a primary source, the day that Nixon resigned in 1974. So this was printed while the event was still occurring, so we consider that a primary source. We look back on this for information. Another form of a primary source document could also be a letter, like Nixon's formal resignation letter that I will insert here. Some primary sources also come in the form of visual aid. Some of those include photographs, like pictures of the Watergate scandal occurring that I will insert right now.
A lot of American citizens were very upset over Nixon and the Watergate scandal. These are some citizens reading that Nixon has just resigned outside of the White House.
Besides pictures, there are also videos, like of Nixon's "I am not a crook" speech that was very connected to the Watergate scandal, which I will insert here.
I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned...
So if we look back at our definition of a primary source, we can see that all of these fall into this category because they're pieces of evidence that were collected or created during the Watergate scandal time frame, and now in a more modern time period, we can look back on these pieces and it helps us kind of understand, to investigate, to learn more about this historical event because of these sources. So now that we've talked about primary sources, now we'll talk about a secondary source. So these are pieces of information pertaining to an event that are created after this event has already happened. So a lot of these are interpretations or reviews of an historical event that create a different perspective. Some examples of these secondary sources that could pertain to the scandal could be books.
A simple search on Amazon will bring you thousands of options for books on the Watergate scandal, like this book called The Great Cover-Up.
Textbooks.
This is a page from a textbook that allows students to analyze the event.
Documentaries.
A simple Google search will also bring you to countless documentaries about the Watergate scandal, like this one.
Now, with most things, there are always pros and cons. So now we're going to talk about the pros and cons of both primary and secondary sources when we're looking at them from the perspective of the classroom and the student. So first we'll talk about the pros of a primary source. So primary sources a lot of the times have very vivid details, and it also creates a very personal feel that allows you to connect to a source. So when people are very connected to a certain event, they're more likely to have a lot of emotion associated with that event, and they'll write down more information. And these primary sources, the more information that they have, the more we'll be able to analyze this history. And that's a very big pro, is that these primary sources, while they have a lot of detail, it allows us as people that weren't able to be at that event to look back at them and have a more clear understanding of what went on. So the pros of a secondary source is that there's a lot of analysis associated with these sources. While they weren't created at the same time of the event, it gives a lot of time for historians and researchers to gather a lot of information from these primary sources and sometimes other secondary sources, and to analyze the actual event to give us a better perspective on it. And there's also a lot more objective than a primary source. Whereas if you're at an event and you're experiencing something, you have a lot of personal bias from your own perspective of what you witnessed, and there's a lot of emotions attached to the specific event that you're discussing. But when you're a secondary source and you're able to step back and you're not personally connected to the event, you can be a lot more objective. So while there are pros to both primary and secondary sources, there are also cons. So that's what we'll talk about right now. Some of the cons to the primary sources are that errors are less likely to be discovered. So since we're usually studying history that's happened in the past, a lot of people studying this history were not alive or were not old enough to remember the history that they're studying. And so if they weren't there in the actual events and they're relying on these sources to gain information, it's harder to realize when there are errors in the actual sources. And another one, like I mentioned before, is that primary sources have a lot of emotional bias. And when there's bias in information, sometimes this makes the information stretched out, maybe a little incorrect. The last con is that this information can be outdated in more ways than one. It can have outdated language that we no longer either speak or we understand, or it can also be outdated as in the document could be very weathered, or it can be very hard to translate or to see, and that makes it a lot harder for us to analyze these kind of things. So there are also cons to secondary sources, the big one of this being that it many times removes the reader from this information that they're trying to learn, because it is information that's in the past that they are trying to understand and they have not experienced the event, and so it's very hard to connect the reader to that information. As a student, a lot of secondary sources that we use are textbooks, and when we read all of this dense information, it's a lot of words on the page that you have to try to interpret, and as someone that has not experienced that event, that is very hard to do, and a lot of times secondary sources can become very dull, and that's why primary sources are very beneficial, because we see these videos and we're able to look at pictures and we're kind of putting ourselves into the history rather than trying to analyze it from a point very far away from the event time-wise. We're kind of able to travel back in time with these primary sources and place ourselves in that history, which makes it a lot easier to grasp and understand. So the one con to a secondary source is that it can be dull and it can be very hard for a reader to connect to this information. So that is it for primary sources, the definitions, the pros and the cons of both. I hope that y'all learned something from this, and thank you.